The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Good morning. How's everybody doing? I know some of y'all are waiting for this one. We're going to have a beautiful exploration into the lives of one of the great ones. So I hope everybody's doing okay. Last week, Norman Brown, the brother that woke me up, who was my vice chair in CORE, he and I did a presentation on Dengani, who was one of the leaders of both the Black Freedom, Black Power, and Black Arts movement. And afterwards, at 2, we had a community celebration of his life. And we recorded a lot of what people had to say. And this will be put into a film eventually. So that was a part of the week of honoring African American, or what I prefer to call New African culture. And Dengani is one of the unknown heroes. One of my viewers in South Africa asked for information on Dengani, and I'm going to post a magazine that was put out by Marvin X, and a special part of that issue was dedicated to Dengani, so people can plug in and get more information on his history. I want to welcome Eric Watson. Peace to you, Brother Ogawa, Sister Lisa Grayson, Gloria Briscoe, Sister Robin, and Sun Temple. And I saw Robin check in real early this morning and then pipe back in right now. So we got you, huh, Robin? So greetings to all of you and others who will tune in. So the theme for this morning's show is an extension of the discussion of African American culture, or what I prefer to call New African culture, because it was reforged in this country based on fundamental African principles with new additions, and then a lot of stuff we have to struggle against. You all know about that. So This is another conversation dealing with New African and African American culture. And the this title for this show, which those of you that saw the publication on this, the title is My Life Knowing Professor John Henrik Clarke's Magnificent Expression of African American Culture. This will feature my own interaction with John Henrik Clarke over a long time. We were close. And it'll also look at how his life was shaped by African American culture and by African culture. But African American culture is founded on that. That's what brought him up. And then as he begins to explore the world of Africa through scholarship, then he becomes the example of those Black folks who are not only Black, but African. And it's hard to get a lot of our people to move from Black to African. Or if you're in the Caribbean, from Jamaican to African. It means you're still Afro-Jamaican, but you're an African, Barbadian, whatever. You know what I mean? That's a hard trip for some of us to make. Wasn't hard for John, and you'll see why. And some of you already know, but I'll be giving you some retrospective in terms of my own life experience with him. I apprenticed under him for a long time, and he was a good friend. So we're going to be looking at the best of our people, in this case, a great human being and a great scholar. But his greatness stands more than anything on his humanity. And that's what he always said about the masters who he apprenticed under. It was always Arthur Schoenberg, what a great person he was. Willis Huggins, what a great person he was. It was always the quality of the character of the masters, and that's an extension of the African mastery system. So this discussion today will be entitled My Life Knowing Professor John Henrik Clarke, a magnificent expression of African American culture. But before that, I want to get into a news item, and this news item affects all of you. And some of you don't think it does because you're into the denial mode. And I hope that you get this message, and it's not a pleasant one. A study has come out just recently, and it has to do with health. And your health is your wealth. I believe it. I practice it. Health comes before everything with me. You know what I mean? Everything, you know? Anything that's unhealthy in my life ain't going to be around me too long, or I'm going to stress it out. It ain't going to stress me out. So a report has just come out that shows that the average life expectancy of Americans has fallen dramatically, having the worst 2-year decline in 100 years. I really want to stress this. Ours is already too low, the Black life expectancy. And that's your average, 50%, above 50% at or below, you know? So ours is not what it should be to begin with. But between 2020 and 2021, over a 2-year period, there has been the sharpest decline in life expectancy among Americans, the worst in 100 years. So a lot of us will dismiss this and say, oh, yeah, well, it's already bad, blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah, worse than 100 years. It's kind of like these floods that are hitting you, you know, and this hot weather that's hitting you. That's supposed to happen every 1,000 years, happening every other year. So in 2021, the average person in the United States could expect to live to the age of 76, compared to the average life expectancy in 2021 in Europe of 78.59 years. The Europeans live longer because they actually have a healthcare system, but that ain't that long. I'm 83. That ain't no time, baby. You know what I mean? That ain't no time. So between 2019 and 2021, The average American lost, we're talking the average overall, all ethnic groups combined, this is the total figure, lost 3 years of life expectancy between 2019 and 2021. And for those of you that think that COVID didn't affect us, and some of us got their heads in the sand and say it's not even real, the government figures are 1 million people in this country have died. I guess it's over 2 million because this country doesn't care to count. It has no healthcare system. And the more people they write off, they could care less. And the way this thing was mismanaged in the United States was a crime, it was criminal. But then some of us were foolish enough to go along with the propaganda. You know what I mean? And I'm telling you, you should be wearing your mask because the main contributor to this decline is COVID, 219. But there are other reasons as well, which have always led to a decline in life expectancy among our people and some other groups. The worst hit and the loss of life expectancy, you should know who it would be. It wouldn't be you. You should already know the answer. Native Americans and Native Alaskans. That's not the white people living in Alaska. Those are the original people there who used to have a long life expectancy, as did the Native Americans, until they got put on reservations. And until they got fed government rations, and until they lived on reservations with no running water, 10 and 11 people packed in a little room, and on reservations that are food starved in terms of having any food around them that's nutritious, and what's coming from the government gives them diabetes and everything else. So Native Americans and Native Alaskans are overall lost 6.5 years of life expectancy during the 20 to 21 period. And by the way, Native Americans did more than a lot of groups in terms of masking and everything else, but because of the dire circumstances they live under, domestic colonialism, and you and I live under semi-colonialism, as a result, it still had a massive effect on their life expectancy. They've been hit so hard that they are at the life expectancy of the average person in the United States in 1944, because their life expectancy now is 65 years of age. Now, in 2020, African Americans experienced a loss of 3 years of life expectancy in 2020. Going to the level of 71.5 years average, meaning the average life expectancy half below and half above 71.5 years. In 2020, whites lost 1.4 years, taking their life expectancy down to 77.4 years from 78.8 years. So that was in 2020. COVID is the major cause in this decline, but not the sole cause. But we know for Black people, it's a major cause, though not the sole, because while we make up 12.8% of the population of the United States, 22.1% of the deaths, and this is according to their recorded stuff, it's worse than that, actually. 22.1% of the deaths of COVID in the United States was assumed by Black people. 22.1%, but we're 12.8% of the total population. You got Black people running around without masks on right now. I work out at the Y. Almost everybody at the Y's got their mask off, even though it's saying, please keep it on. They're not making it mandatory. Why? Corporations want to go back to work. And so if you drop dead, too bad. They'll get somebody else to take your place. You know what I mean? So other factors that contribute to the decrease in life expectancy among Blacks is, and among Native Americans, particularly Native Americans, is domestic colonialism. And the fact that they were defeated, stuck on reservations, they had healthy diets. They lived a long life until they got put in this defeat syndrome. And after 90% of them had been wiped out, 10% left, and they get stuck on reservations, got everything hitting them. So as I pointed out, many of these reservations, no running water in their homes, no toilets in a lot of their homes. A lot of people are packed into these homes with 11 and 12 people. And so when COVID goes around, it's really spread. And then lack of medical care, and then abject poverty. So all of this has contributed to low life expectancy among Native Americans. There was a time where they had a healthy diet, where they were free, and they went under this oppression. African Americans or new Africans, blacks in this country, face semi-colonialism. And so that means that our communities are occupied by the police like occupying armies. Our economies are put in a dependent position where the capital is not there very often for capital development. And so our businesses, 97% of them are owned by one person, and those businesses are only supported by blacks. It's the only economy in the US that doesn't get support outside of its own ethnic group. It's only blacks that support black businesses. And not enough of us, but we are the supporters. So we're living in blacks. Other things that contribute to this lowering of life expectancy is we're living in communities that are food deserts, where if you got anything in terms of buying food, it's something you don't want to eat. You got more liquor stores than anything else. And of course, churches. Most of our people are working on low-end service jobs that pay hardly nothing or are unemployed. Some are in high-skilled jobs, but it's a minority. So all of this contributes to a standard of life that's harmful. You can't afford food. And look at how food is going up right now. And then we're paying more for rent and getting less, and then facing eviction and everything else. And when that happens, it's often homelessness. Then our neighborhoods have disinvestment. There's no capital investment in the neighborhoods, except when they're getting ready to flip them, for whites who are going to move in. So all of these things, and then we're often concentrated in neighborhoods that are toxic. And so all of this is affecting Black folks' health. They will generally locate toxic plants in Black communities or next to them, or Native American, and sometimes Latino. So all of this puts us in this position. A primary reason for this show is just to pass on some stuff to the folks coming after us, younger people, and anybody else that's interested. Knowledge of self. But one of the things is to promote healthy living under oppression. You hear me? Under oppression. And so in spite of all this stuff, what we need to be doing is paying attention to our health, as difficult as it is living under the circumstances we're living under. And so the first thing is, if you free your mind, chances are you're going to be able to reduce or eliminate stress. And that's what the Sixfold Stages to Mental Freedom, the seminar that I hope we'll be offering soon, will do, a year-long seminar that deals with the Free the Mind process, which is mind, body, and spirit, that puts you in a healthier condition. And when you love yourself, you're going to do everything you can to preserve your health. And I know a lot of people watching this show do that, but a lot of us don't. So one of the things we know is exercise is a good thing. And now they've suddenly reached this real profound conclusion that, if the exercise is both weights and running, that they're saying, may contribute to a longer life. I can tell you, being in the gym for 25 years and pumping iron and running on a treadmill, I'm not much of a runner other than that, that after about 6 months, when I started this in 1997, I got mental sharpness that I didn't have before. And that's part of what happens, when your temple is in good shape. then the spirit and everything can work better, and the mind can work better. So working out is good. And then eating healthy. And I've told people, a lot of them haven't heard this, but as a strategist, my first strategy is to live past 100. And most people that live past 100, they don't have any relatives that live past 100. Most people that live to that age, it's based on what they do. A very few is it based on genetics. And so there's a study on longevity. Some have heard this before, but most haven't, that shows that there's only one thing that will increase life expectancy, only one thing. And most people who are into health don't even know what that one thing is. Your health is your wealth. Everybody says it, and then they're broke and trying to do everything to deal with money and neglect their health. You know what I mean? So what is that one thing? People who do research on this know this. Most people who deal with health, nutrition, and stuff don't know this. You'll say it's a vegetarian diet. Well, that's not bad. I mean, if you choose a vegetarian diet, but that isn't what prolongs life. Eating less. A lot of people work out at the Y and their weight doesn't change because they're eating the same stuff too much, and they're not burning enough calories to kill, the excess weight. But what's the ideal level? 1,400 calories a day. That's what the longest study on longevity shows. It shows that an average diet, by diet, I don't mean dieting, but average food consumption a day of 1,400 calories with the right foods, a proper mixture of yellow and green vegetables, fruits, and no more meat than this. And that's once a day because you need protein. That increases your life expectancy by 30%. 30%. It slows down aging. And that's a process that's happened with me because the way my skin is now, it's healthier than it was 20 years ago. And I was working on it 20 years ago, But the point is, it lowers your it increases your resistance to any kind of disease, and it eliminates free radicals for a long time. That means that if your normal life expectancy is 80, and then you do this, you're adding another 24 years to your life. And most of that will be disease-free. It may all be disease-free, but most of it will be disease-free because, you're dealing with your cell structure. I pointed out on this show that I have an antioxidant score of 93,000. You don't know what that is, but that's the test that tests the health of your cells. 50,000 is excellent. Mine's 93,000. They've never seen a score like that, and that's because I'm tending to my physical and my mental and spiritual health. I cause stress. I don't get too much. And I only cause it when somebody's giving me trouble. You know what I mean? So, so much for that. But I had to deal with that because this is important. You need to be here as long as possible to enjoy every minute and do whatever you can to contribute to the liberation of your people. So my topic for today is knowing Professor John Henrik Clarke, a magnificent expression of African-American culture. By the way, he wished that he had taken better care of his health, because had he gone for regular eye checkups, he wouldn't have lost his eyesight. He had glaucoma, and all he had to do, if he had gone and got his test, early enough, is take the eye drops. That has solved it. He blamed some of his eye problems on pork. I don't know about that one, but I know that had he stayed on top of it, he didn't have to be blind. You know what I mean? Now, John Henrik Clarke is a great figure because of his intellect, because of his historical contributions, but most important, because of his beautiful character. He was a wonderful human being. It was my privilege to apprentice under him for over 25 years, and we had a close relationship. The last couple of years of his life, I was on the phone talking to him at least 3 times a week, and we interacted in a lot of different ways, and I learned a lot from him. And generally, when I've apprenticed, John Henrik Clarke, I apprenticed under directly. Jacob Carruthers, I apprenticed under directly. And I don't usually have a criteria. I don't say, oh, I'm going to apprentice under this because. But when I look at it later, why did I apprentice under John Henrik Clarke? Because his interests and mine matched. He's a historian, so am I. And he's not a philosopher, but he was a deep thinker. And so Jacob Carruthers called the old scholars, John Jackson, the others coming before them, the old scrapers, Doc Ben, the old scrapers. And that meant they were the old fighters, J.A. Rogers. They were fact people. They gave us information so we could defend a position. And so that was the nature of those scholars. John Henrik Clarke was like a bridge to the generation that I come out of, in that, along with Chancellor Williams, he was a theoretical historian. That is, he put things in an intellectual framework. He wasn't a philosopher, but he was deep in his thought. And so Jacob Carruthers was like the person that he would send to represent him when he couldn't speak. The only time I ever heard Jake brag was when he said, John sends me to speak when he can't go. That was a high compliment. You hear me? So I was drawn to him because he was a historian, but I was also drawn to him because he's political. He was political. And I bring both of those together. I didn't apprentice under Theophil Obenga. He's 2 years younger, 2 years older than me. He's in my age. Same thing with Asa Hilliard. He was a friend, but I didn't apprentice under him. They were close to my age, but also in the case of Asa Hilliard, his concentrations, while similar on Kemet, they were also special in certain ways in which I can consult with him, but it wasn't for the purpose of apprenticeship. But I learned from him, But John, it was a conscious apprenticeship, as it was with Jake from Chicago, those Jacob Carruthers. So John Henrik Clarke was born January the 1st, 1915. Leonard Jeffries likes to say him and John and Sheikh Diop are the same. They are all Capricorns. And I remember when he said that, we were at the favorite restaurant of John Henrik Clarke that I introduced him to in Oakland. It's called the Gingerbread House. That was John's favorite restaurant in the whole world. And so we were having a meeting of Black scholars who had a brain thrust to guide the African-centered educational movement. And so what does Leonard Jeffries do but say, yeah, I'm born under the same sign as John Henrik Clarke. And the only time I saw intolerance with Jacob Carruthers was when you said astrology. He went off. I had to laugh. And Jake knew I was into astrology. I never talked to him about it, but I know Conrad Worrell, chair of the National Black United Front, told him. But I also knew, don't waste your time on that. If that's what he thinks, that's what he thinks. So John was born January 1st, 1915 in Union Springs, Alabama. And he was born of a sharecropping family, as my father was, And while his father was a jackleg preacher, meaning he preached when he could, and then later got a church later on. So his father picked cotton, and his mother was a washerwoman. She washed the clothes of poor white women and white men. And she would carry John Henrik Clarke along in a little red barrel, sitting him on the top of these clothes that needed to be washed. And so that was part of John's early life. Now, John's father had an ambition for him. He wanted him to own his own land. That was the dream of Black farmers coming out of Reconstruction and then post-Reconstruction, but especially Reconstruction. We wanted 40 acres and a mule. So his father was wishing the best that he could think of for his son. John would have different ideas. So this was real key. John is raised up under the conditions of post-Reconstruction South. And that's new slavery, where every white person considered themselves to be the masters of every Black person. And he lives in the post-1876 Hayes-Tilden Compromise, where Rutherford B. Hayes, to get elected president, agrees to withdraw federal troops and put a couple of Southerners on the Supreme Court to wipe out what was left of civil rights gains, particularly the Civil Rights Bill. And of course, Blacks were ground into the dust when it came to voting. What's commonly not known is the assumption is all of this was just the product of 1876, that before that, federal troops were in the South protecting us, and we were waging an effort to go further. So we had the right to vote. But what's not normally noted is there were hardly any federal troops in the South under the Grant administration and under the Johnson administration that had opposed Reconstruction and then forced a military Reconstruction on the South. And that military Reconstruction was to protect Northern economic interests, not to protect Black people. So there were not enough soldiers in the South to protect Black people against the Klan that was riding from 1865 on under Bedford Forrest, a former general in the Confederate Army, head of the Ku Klux Klan. And Blacks had largely been disarmed. Some of us still had weapons, mostly shotguns. And so we weren't in the position to do the kind of defense that we needed to do. John was raised under those circumstances. And contrary to, and by the way, it's not just Rutherford B. Hayes that agreed to withdraw the troops from the South. Grant had already reached that agreement, and that's in no history book. With the plantocracy, he had agreed for home rule, that the South would be able to run its own business. And so all Rutherford B. Hayes was doing was cashing in on General Grant's promise. That's not in any history book, by the way. So John was raised under those circumstances. And also, John's family was a sharecropping family. That was 80% of Blacks were driven into sharecropping. But what's not commonly known is 40% of whites were sharecroppers. And how could that happen? With post-Reconstruction, they stripped Blacks completely of the right to vote, and they stripped millions of whites of the right to vote because they didn't want them rising up against the poverty that they would face. And so these were the conditions that John was raised under. And it's out of these conditions, particularly the nature of the Black community, that shaped John Henrik Clarke. He was an expression first of African American or New African culture, and then as he dived deeply into Africa, of African culture. A Black person expressing Black culture who now is deep into African culture, but he was first and foremost a product of this new African culture. So this is key in understanding John Henrik Clarke, is to understand the forces that shaped him. And these forces had to do with the structure of the Black community, the way in which the Black community was structured after slavery, and it was the culture shaped during enslavement that would shape John in its most positive way. John was a person who, at a very early age, fell in love with Africa. He's a product of African American culture, but his earliest experiences come from his exposure to Africa through his great-grandmother, Ma Mary, who lived to be 108 years of age. Well, she lived longer, but the period that John gives in her influence over him, she was 108 years old. By the way, this speaks to another feature of African culture. The average age of Africans during enslavement was probably around 50. But you had a large number of Africans that lived past 100 to 126, 127. Now, if it was post-traumatic slave syndrome, the only thing operating, how do you explain that? Because Africans carried over health practices from Africa to America, and the more African you were, the more healthy you had a chance of becoming. And so she was one of those, Ma Mary, 108 years of age, when John was messing up, and she would tell somebody, give me a stick. And John said, at 108, what could she do with a stick? He'd go get her a stick. And he said he got a few love taps. And then he'd sit in his grandmother's lap. And what would she do? She would tell stories about Africa. You hear me? And she would particularly tell stories about Africans who had just come over, because during the Civil War, you still had Africans coming here, even though the slave trade had been abolished and you weren't supposed to be bringing any in. If you read Zora Neale Hurston, she's got a little book that came out recently on the last African. He was one of a number coming directly from Africa during the Civil War and right before the Civil War. So she was talking about to John about Africans who came to America enslaved, couldn't speak no African language, any American language. They were speaking an African language. And what was she telling him this for? Because she was particularly passing on the story of his great-great-grandfather, Buck, B-U-C-K. That should tell you something right there. He was somebody, that name fit him. He was bucking white racism. He was bucking slavery. He was a powerful, fearless African. And see, it was common among Africans who had been here for a couple of generations that when they had contact with Africans coming directly from Africa, saltwater Africans, if you read the slave narratives, almost all of them would say this. They were endowed with African bravery. You hear me? The baddest warriors come out of Africa. The only reason why you're here is you didn't have Gatling guns. If you had that, you wouldn't be here. And that Civil War was decided by Black men and some Black women disguised as soldiers, 170 plus thousand, who won the Civil War. And it surprises some Black people because they got this pity pot mentality of the enslaved African. Enslaved African was tough. They're coming out of secret societies. These were warrior societies, and these traditions were passed on. And I'm not going to have time today to talk about how John underwent this training himself in the mastery system, not as a warrior, but as a scholar, but a warrior in the sense that he's defending Africa and African-American people, in this country and around the world. So if you look at Ma Mary was exposing John, as he said, to the bravery and strength of Africa. And it was in the form, particularly, of his great-great-grandfather, Buck. And he said that it was through the strength of Africa and the courage of Africa that Africa was first planted in his mind by his grandmother. So John Henrik Clarke was a product of African-American culture. And he got a heavy dose at a young age of the deepest part, the African part, the brave part, the take no compromise part. That led him to hold his head real high. But the other thing is, John was a product of the institutions of Africa that we established here in America that would shape him. And the biggest one was the institution of the extended family community. And that's what also really shaped John's identity and sense of being. John also gained from his grandmother and from Blacks all around him a deep sense of spirituality. And John would often, because I see a lot of these posts that are on Facebook and everything else, where John's making the distinction between religion and spirituality. His grandmother was a Baptist, but she was a Baptist in the African sense. She wasn't so theological. She was more spirit Baptist, and she was into being baptized in the water as opposed to Methodists being sprinkled with water. But she's coming out of a tradition where blacks, when they decide to drop voodoo into what becomes the black church, they pick the black church where black people have a say-so. Because in Africa, democracy is as natural, as breathing. And so they picked those institutions where they could run their own stuff. And she was an expression of that. And John, as a historian, was heavily focused on African history as a historian. And when it was spirituality, it had more to do with things like Jesus being black and stuff, and the distinction between religion that's a male killer cult and spirituality that is about raising you up. But John didn't really explore African spirit systems because he was embedded in this new African thing. He was not a churchgoer, but he had that spirit inside of him. And that was one of the most beautiful things about him, his spirituality. And that spirituality was expressed in the kindness of him as a person. I really love John more than anything for his character, his brilliance. He often would tell me, I have a mind better than any 40 people. I'd say, oh no, John, like 400, more like 400. But John was not a braggart. He was not egotistical. He was humble, but not in the door walking sense, where you're a doormat and you can walk over somebody. No, he had a healthy sense of his own being. He had a healthy ego, but he was not egotistical. He was a humble person, a kind person. And that's what he liked about all of his masters, Arthur Schoenberg, Wallace Huggins, and others. So Mom Mary opened John Henrik Clarke's door. This is called the Seba experience. My book that I'm finishing now on Seba deals with this in great depth, to replace this Western system of dropping facts on people and they just regurgitate facts. Seba's a system where your light gets opened. And in this particular case, Grandma Mary, was opening John up to his destiny in life. And I think that was a predetermined agreement made in heaven before they came here. And she agreed to play that role. But whether that's true or not, that's the role she played. And it set John on his course in life. It was the big message coming from Ma Mary, his beautiful grandmother, who was one of what he called the three deities in his life. See, John Henrik Clarke had a great respect for Black women, and he deified them. We shared that in common. I overdid it. That's what caused some problems for me. I tended to romanticize Black women too much, and it was something I had to deal with. That was a crisis I went through in my life and so forth. But we also both had this great respect for Black women, and I also have my Black deities in my life, and as he had his, that were the saving grace for me. When the FBI is doing me in and trying to take a job, there's Ray Richardson out there, co-owner of Marcus Bookstore, saying, well, he needs a job. Get me a job. Then the FBI bouncing me out, and I could have beat him. The spirit said, don't fight. And then the next thing you know, she's got me another job, San Francisco State, along with the sister named Nansisi Caillou. And then my mother and father and those, but Black women, key Black women have been key in my life, key in his. He called them the deities in his life. John didn't have no issues with Black women, and he was not a playboy. You know what I mean? Could have been, in that he had the qualities that women just love. He was nice and smart and hardworking. You know what I mean? So that spirituality, that love of Africa that Mom Mary instilled in him was real key in his life, throughout his life. And he practiced what he preached. And so John was in the pursuit of truth, but he was an honest, integral person. a person with a lot of integrity. So this love of Africa was real key. And one of the things I respected most about John was also his love of Black people as well as Africa. And we shared a common agreement. One of the reasons why I picked him as a master is he was a generalist, meaning he was interested in all of Africa. And he would often contrast his interest to Dr. Joseph Ben Yochanan. And this was no criticism. He was just simply saying what Ben was about and what he was about. They were two buddies, you know. He told me once, we were having a conversation, he said, for Doc Ben, he said, Egypt's a fetish, meaning his whole life was dedicated to it. Well, that's Doc Ben. That's a good thing. And he produced a whole lot of stuff around that. And, I think the best of his works is the book on, the gift of Africa, a gift to major Western, to major world religions. His book on religion, that's his best one. But John was a generalist. So he was interested in Egypt, but he was interested in all of Africa. And then we shared this in common. John was interested in the intersection between African history and world history. For John, world history was Europe. My interest is that, but for me, it's not just Europe. It's Asia, China in particular. It's Latin America, Mexico in particular. And it's European history and culture, because that's the force that we're up against. But we shared this general view. And this general view is consistent with traditional African views. Traditionalists who are masters don't just specialize in one thing, because they understand that life, nature, everything is interconnected. So masters are multidimensional. And that's true in all walks of life for us. My wife, whose father was the first person in Barbados to get a degree in architecture from Oxford, was already a builder before he got this degree. So he could do everything in putting a house together, whereas most Western architects can only put a floor plan together. You know what I mean? That's the nature of African mastery. But the key to African mastery is the mastery of character. And that's what John had in spades. Great character. So that matching was key for us. And I learned a lot from him, because him having interests in line with mine and being more advanced than me, then I could learn from him. And so the first thing I asked him when I started apprenticing under him, and mind you, I'm a mature scholar at this point. I'm not like John was when he went up under Schoenberg. He's a kid. I'm developed. I'm a warrior, and I've done different things. But now I want to go to another level. So I said, hey, John, what should I read? John said, read Oswald Spengler, Decline of the West, Volume 1 and 2. I said, yeah, I read it. Decline of the West, Volume 1 and 2. I read all of Spengler's works, Man of the Technique, Hour and Decision. Those were two other works. His works were banned in Europe as a German historian for over 20 years, because he predicted the decline of the West before it went into decline. So John gave me another assignment then. He said, go read Churchill's memoirs. I'm saying, oh, shit. 6 volumes. And it was based on him pulling all his records from World War II. He got a Nobel Prize for it, but it was his version of World War II. So I read it, because John is doing to me what was done to him. His master, Arthur Schoenberg, the first thing he did when he first met him was tell him to go and study how your enemy took you out of history, so you know your history. So that was my experience. I began this apprenticeship under John, but it was his character that was the most important, his goodness as a human being, and his kindness. One of the things about John was also that he was wide open. He had this quality, because the last 8 months of his life, I interviewed him on the masters in his life. And I would ask him sometimes the same question more than once. It would be over a number of different times, because I had a number of interviews with him on the phone on this. And then the final one was in his wife's house. in New York in 1998 after an ASCAC conference in New York. And so I'm asking him a question, and he's giving me a different answer than before, but not inconsistent. And I said, hey, John, you're like Coltrane. You know, you never play the same music the same way twice. He said, yes. He said, life is like a circle. Now, it's really like a spiral because very few planets orbit circularly. Most of them, it's elliptical motion. But I know what he meant. It means that it's moving from one spot to the other, and it's got an angle to it. And so John made the point that he's always open-minded when he approaches something. And he views whatever he is studying as an open-ended process. He doesn't see that he has the final answer. And then he made the point. When you have the final answer, that's final arrogance. And you're frozen. And John was not arrogant. And so in that sense, his mind worked like a jazz musician, you know, constantly improvising, constantly coming up with a new angle. And that was also the product of wisdom that had been cultivated over years because the man was humble. He learned from his mistakes, and he made mistakes, and he would acknowledge it, you know. So this was a part of John. He was an improviser and creative, and was always coming up with another way to look at things. And he was a good listener, a real good listener. And he always had time for people, always had time. And when he go to a conference, he wouldn't just come in and speak, he'd stay for the whole conference, even as his energy was leaving him because of cancer, you know. John had this idea of greatness about him. You know, that's his high self-esteem, even before he had achieved greatness. And so he divided his life into periods. And so he had what he called the Molten Street period, Molten, the Molten Street period. Now, you would think this would be the account of some multimillionaire, you know, or somebody who's coming from some big family with big power, and he's describing his younger years. Now, this was a time in which John had been privileged of all of his family members to go to school. The rest of them had to do sharecropping. But John was broke, you know, as a church mouse. He was a poor young kid being raised up in a community at first with a stepmother raising him. But the Molten Street years, he also called that his formative years. Because when I'd interview him on the mastery system, I wouldn't use my term, which would be imitation. I'd say, well, let's talk about your formative years. And that was the Molten Street period in its early period up to high school. So John was shaped by this extended family community that he described, and I'll quote him as, quote, a complete totality within a Black community because everyone looked out for each other. So this is post-Reconstruction South, but Black people taking care of each other because that's what they did during enslavement. That's what they did right after. And so the extended family community shaped him, just as his grandmother did, who was the extended family part of it, and you know, grandmother. But extended family community, these are people, he said, I called a lot of people uncles that I realized later had no blood relationship to me. That was common. And until drugs hit the Black community, that was a common feature in Black communities in general. It still exists, but it's weaker. So John was raised in this context. The other thing is John's time for coming up was a time where Southern Black communities and most Northern Black communities, the main influence in the life of a people was the church. And we got all these conscious Black people putting down the church. I had a discussion with my friend, my best friend, on this church thing. They're telling me how Christianity reminds them of the Aryan system. And I had to tell him, listen, you should read Nietzsche on this. Nietzsche is their best philosopher on the madness of the West, Aryan thinker. If you want to know the modern one, read Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. And what does he say? He said, Judaism, which is at the base of Christianity, Judaism comes out of the practice and the teachings of Judaism come out of the 18th dynasty, Akhenaten. He was a priest in the mystery systems. He learned his 10 commandments from him. He learned a lot of the theology of life after death and all the rest of this stuff from him. You understand? So that when you're looking at Judaism, then out of which comes Christianity and then Islam, they're coming from an African base, but distorted because they become a religion. The African system is a spirit system, not a religion. But there's common things. So I was just pointing out to my friend, I said, listen, man, you need to understand. You should check out Nietzsche on this. He makes the point that, and the main point I make with him is, no, you can't say that Christianity is Arianism because it comes from the Hebrews. The Hebrews are Semites. They're not Aryans. Yes, they're nomadic. Yes, they're patriarchal. But no, they're not Aryan. And if you know the Aryan, there's a big fat difference. And I'm not going into that right now. You want to talk about the savage of the savages, that's Aryanism. And that isn't Adolf Hitler. By the way, Hitler was copying the United States, by the way. Now, we're talking 3000 BC. When they come out of the Caucasus Mountains and, they come out of Ukraine, by the way, and sweep into various parts of the world. But the key point is, Nietzsche's point is, Christianity is a problem because he said, with its Jewish foundation, he said they executed a moral revolution and they won. And what he meant was Aryanism worships power. The only thing that's good in Aryanism is power. There's no morals, it's just power. But what happens with the Christian ethos coming out of the Hebrew thing that infects Christianity, that thing is about the meek shall inherit the earth. That's under Jesus. Now, Old Testament, and that's what the European has tried to use. It tries to do something else. But his point is that with any sector of Aryans embracing that, they're going against their own worldview. And that's a problem because we're always looking at, well, the African got a problem because, we got this Christianity dropped on us. But the Christianity John got dropped on him was the stuff, the voodoo that Black people took and dropped into Christianity after slavery because we refused to embrace it during slavery. You hear me? So this is a different story. Now you could say, well, they've done pretty well with Christianity. They've conquered the world. They've given us the Bible. They took the land. You can go through all of that. But the fact is that what they adhere to as their doctrine of religion isn't Aryan. It doesn't flow out of their culture. So they've had to try and reconcile it in various ways. You hear me? And it's caused them some problems. So John was, influenced by this spirituality coming out of this thing here, basic to his nature, but also basic to the culture. And the main reason, the humanism of Africans, that they could take care of each other, that totality of the community that he described, a caring community. So in the South and in the North at this time, Black community revolved around the church. It doesn't anymore, but it did then. And in his community, Moulton, it revolved around Macedonia Baptist Church, which is funny because the leader of the Baptist Ministers Union, San Francisco Freedom Movement, came from Macedonia Baptist Church. He wasn't a man of great integrity, but we got to utilize his talents when we needed them. You know what I mean? I thought that was kind of, well, that's interesting. But Macedonia Baptist Church, the preacher was Reverend Chapman, Chapman. His sister was a sister named Miss Pearl. Miss Pearl. In the South, you're Miss or Mr. That's the respect. Now, this is another quality of John Henrik Clarke. And this is a quality pervasive among African American people, particularly those coming out of slavery and those right after. But to this day, it's a quality, but a central quality then, a central quality. And so what did Miss Pearl, the Reverend Sister, have to say, because she had status in the church, not the church, the church. You know what I'm talking about? She started a rumor, and John repeats this rumor because John acts like he didn't like it. John liked it. John liked it. She said, quote, John was a little gentleman because she always saw him tipping his hat. And I know that meant to ladies. You know what I mean? And he's a little boy tipping his hat. And he had a hat too. So that's another thing about John. John was always clean. You hear me? Clean. That's the nature of the enslaved African. When they come off the plantation, you know, the end of slavery, those are the cleanest, most royal Africans you got. My wife talks about that because that's true in the Caribbean. I've referred to this before. In the Caribbean, they call them poor great, financially poor, great in every other way, carry themselves like they own the world. My grandmother was like that. I've talked about her before. My great-grandmother would say, look at her. She was black as midnight, as pretty as midnight, and knew it, and was proud. Deep and down, coming from Mississippi, where hell is hell. And my great-grandmother would say, look at my daughter there. She walks like she owns the world, ain't got a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out. That was my grandmother. You hear me? That was a whole lot of black people. Yeah, we suffered from some low self-esteem. Yeah, we had black people that fight you for calling them black, but we had some black people who are proud of it. And John was coming up under that influence. His grandmother, the people in his community. And so John said, I wish he would have shut up. Now that was kidding, because that would be disrespectful of his elders, but John actually liked that. That was a compliment because that's what John was. And so John said, so as a result of being defined as a gentleman, he said, I had to concentrate on being a gentleman. You see, the community's raising you. John was a gentleman. In every sense of the word, he was a gentle man. That's what a real gentleman is. A gentle man. He had two secretaries that volunteered to work for them, both retired. One was a nurse. I don't remember the profession of the other. They volunteered his time in his office, and John's office was the size of mine, but his was stacked full of 25,000 books. I need space because space for me is beauty. I got about 11,000 books here and in the hallway, and I need other space to get more bookshelves so I can put them in here. But John's whole study was nothing but books. I went to see him in 1995 to give him my book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, that he wrote one of the introductions to. Asa Hilliard wrote the other. And so I was giving him a signed copy. And then I was telling him about the book I'm writing now, which he was a subject of, along with 5 other masters. So John, was coming out of this situation in his community, where the community was defining him, and in the course of defining him, raising his expectations. And being a gentleman was a part of it. The whole time I knew John, he always wore a suit and tie. Now you say, oh, why is he wearing a suit and tie? Why ain't he wearing African clothes? He wore a suit and tie. You know what I mean? And he liked to get manicures. He was a Capricorn. Some Capricorns are very attentive to every detail in their appearance. Even when he was blind, he was going to get a manicure. That was John. And he was not, again, I want to say, he wasn't egotistical. That's the way he carried himself. Impeccable. You hear me? But that impeccable in carriage was a reflection of the impeccable excellence underneath it. Character excellence, technical excellence. Because he was a reader. They called him Fess as a child, meaning professor. That's why he got advanced to go to school, because of the children in his family. He was the one that showed the most promise. So they needed the rest of them working in the field. So John was the one that got to go to school, So he was a true gentleman. But that was the nature of the enslaved African. The majority of the enslaved Africans carried themselves as royalty. And John did too. I never heard him claiming to have any descent from any royal family, but he carried himself that way. It was imbued in him. My mother carried herself that way. They called her queen, and she was as pretty gets, but she wasn't stuck up on her looks, a straight A student, very smart and very wise, and ended up running an academic preschool. But that was characteristic of Black folks, generally carrying themselves with royalty. And where do you think the blues musicians, the jazz musicians get this great dress from? It's standing up to the culture. It's reflecting the royalty within it. You hear me? And that ain't just true of Black people here. It's Black people all over the Caribbean, South America. That's us. So again, you need to revise your evaluation of the attitude of that enslaved African. That was one proud person. Yeah, some got broken. And those that did, many of them came back, but very few. You can't, it's very hard to break a human being. You hear me? Very hard. So John saw these characteristics all around him, and it influenced his carriage, the way he carried himself in every possible way. Now, as I said before, John shared a special love for Black women. And he described 3 Black women as the deities in his life. John had this real sensitivity to the feminine principle. And when I'm writing the mother principle, I'm consulting him. I'm going to Ghana and looking at the Asante Hina Santawa. Asante Hina is the king, Santawa is the queen mother, and looking at village justice being dispensed there, looking at the lineage system, the opinion system, that the most just male served as first among equal of, and I'm sharing with him my stuff. This was in 1990, right after I had the vision for the mother principle. And I went to Ghana and observing this, and then after, and John was very much into Ghanaian history and culture, spent time in Africa and spent time in Ghana. And so I'm sharing this with him. It's real important to me, you know, that the way the lineage was run is the way the nation was run. It was a male-female thing going on there. And John, because he was so profound, he could summarize this in one word. He said, yes, what I like about Africa, and in this particular case, the Asante system, is its consistency. One word summarized what I had been digesting for a number of months, hooking up with Leonard and Rosalind Jeffries and Wade Nobles and Kumasi in Ghana and whatnot. You know what I mean? So John was sensitive to the position of women, the importance of them, and showed great respect towards them. John put 3 women in this category of deities, Black female deities, goddesses, which, by the way, in traditional African culture is common, particularly coming out of the hunter-gatherer societies, the agrarian societies. Females were central in these societies. And they were central in John's life. So his first deity, of course, was Ma Mary, his grandmother. The other 2 deities in his life was Miss Harris, his 3rd grade teacher, and Miss Evelina Taylor, his 5th grade teacher. Now, John says of his first teacher, and see, each one of them, just like Mom Mary, put him on his roadway to life. See, this is another thing in terms of Black communities and Black culture. The Black school was central. And it may have been a one-room schoolhouse, or it may have been a schoolhouse where there were just a few teachers teaching a lot of students. But these were schoolhouses where teachers did their best to instill excellence as well as skills in their students, and regarded themselves as their parents, and administered love, not just instruction. And so they played a very important part in Fess's life, Fess, because John would go on to be a bibliophile, a collector of books, 25,000, a reader of books, and a teacher, a master teacher, a master professor. And so in the first class, he gets an assignment, Miss Harris's class, and it's to turn in a paper. John couldn't turn the paper in because he was busy doing chores. And so he didn't get to write the paper. So Miss Harris called him up to read the paper. And John brought a piece of paper up. It was blank. He didn't know she'd asked for it. And he faked the story, made it look like he was reading from the paper. Now, an average teacher would have put him down because he had to turn it in. She saw it was blank. And they would have said, I told you that you're supposed to write a paper. You're going to have to stay after class and write 1,000 times on the blackboard, this and that, and embarrass them and everything else. But no, this was a real teacher. This was a teacher about bringing out the inner qualities of their students. And what she saw was something John hadn't seen in his life. And he said that experience of delivering that paper, faking it, but delivering the story, he said this was the first creative, inventive test in my life. First creative, inventive test in my life. Now, let me tell you something. He wouldn't have said that had that teacher put him down. That teacher didn't put him down. What did she say? When she got that blank piece of paper, she said, look at him. He's got an inventive mind. One day, he's going to be a great writer. Great. See, this is the key thing. Great. Contrary to popular opinion, these Black folks who love themselves were inspiring our people to greatness. If you read Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, you know, the hero passes out 138th Street or whatever, getting off the freeway, you know, getting off of the subway. And so what happens is a stranger, a sister, takes him home, nourishes him back to health. And then when he's ready to leave, she says, I only expect one thing of you. What is that? To do something great for your people. You hear me? That's the essence of Blackness in New African culture. Excellence. Stand up for your race. You hear me? And so because she saw this light within him, the Seba, the star within him, the special gift within him, she encouraged it. And John said, for the first time in my life, I started thinking about writing. Huh? John Henrik Clarke was a magnificent expression of African American culture. And then as he sunk deep into it, of African culture, he bridged the two. He was the best expression of both. So that gave him a sense of mission in his life, purpose in his life, because he saw something because of what someone else could see in him that he didn't see. I've had the same experience. You know? People see things in you you don't see. And then as you begin to look at it, you say, oh, and then it sets you on a journey, you know? And then his third deity was Miss Evelina Taylor. Now, you had a color system going on then. And so in the school, you had the light brigade and the dark brigade, this old brainwashing from slavery. So you had light-skinned teachers teaching light-skinned students. And John said, one of my greatest gifts in life was that I was born dark, Black, so that I could have Miss Evelina Taylor as my teacher. That wasn't the only reason why he was glad he was Black. John never had no color issues. He had pride instilled in him all over the place in his community. But this was a special reason for being Black, You hear me? He got to be in Miss Evelina Taylor's class. Now, John was infected by what now whole generations are infected by, the peer group. Every generation has this problem where the peer group wants to play games, wants to play hooky, wants to act like a fool. Well, John was acting like a fool in Miss Evelina's class. See, this is another thing about John. John owned up. You know what I mean? You got some people around so perfect, they can never tell you their faults. They just came on the planet perfect. Yeah. Mr. Goody Goody 2 foot or Miss Goody Goody 2 foot. Ain't no such thing. We all grow and we come from somewhere. So John was honest. He was listening to the peer group and acting like the fool. And so away from the students during a lunch break, Miss Evelina Taylor takes her into her room where she's eating lunch. And she tells him, life is like this. Don't worry about where other people are going. If they're going in the wrong way, don't go with them. If you have to go alone, follow the path of truth. She said, follow the path of truth. And then to get his attention, she put her thumb on his chin so he looked straight at her. And in great kindness, she said this, young man, and John said, this is something every Black child needs to hear, at least once in their life. She said this, I believe in you. I have confidence in you. And I believe that you'll make it. And John said, the rest of his life he spent trying to live up to his grandmother, Mom Mary, and the other two Black deities in his life. And wherever he went, he always thought about not embarrassing them, representing them. John was a representative of the best features of African American culture. You hear me? Now, John gets ready to leave town. Again, he ain't lying. He ain't got no money. He didn't book no train. He's going to hobo. You hear me? And he's got a friend, and they're going to hobo to New York. Now, actually, he went to Chicago first and then New York. And so he's leaving. Now, here's the story on John. When John is living, during his childhood days, he's living with his stepmother, but he can't get along with her. And there's a lot of these problems in relationships. My father had this problem, where his father's second wife didn't want him around, really. And so he was left on his own at 12 years of age to take care of himself, But in the case of John's stepmother, she didn't treat him the way she treated her own children. John didn't like it. So he asked a neighbor to let him stay in her place. And this neighbor had a rooming house. But during the Depression, it turned into a house of night, if you know what I'm talking about. Ladies had to earn a living. But those ladies took care of him. They bought his textbooks. They gave him money to go to the theater. And when the father couldn't go to be represented, at parents' meetings, 4 of them went. And they all knew they were ladies of the night. You hear me? But everybody respected them. This is another thing about John. He was non-judgmental. He wasn't, except when he took you on. He took some people on at the end of his life. And I had conversations with him. And he explained why. I understood it. You know what I mean? But that wasn't judgment either. He's passing on, and they're just some things that he figured had to be fired up. He just had to tell the truth. And some people didn't like it. Too bad. You know what I mean? But John was not judgmental. And so it was these ladies of the night. It was the church. It was the overall community. It was his grandmother, his parents, everybody else that looked after John, nurtured him. And he had the right attitude. He was appreciative. So he's leaving town with what little he had, getting ready to hobo, jump on a freight train, hope he didn't get caught, you know, and he's getting ready to leave town. Now, this could only be in a Black community. One of the ladies of the night was a sister called Sally Chickenfoot. That had to be a sister or a brother with a name like that. Sally Chickenfoot. Sally had been one of those that raised him. She was one of those that, went to school to represent him. And she sticks her head out the window and she sees John going. And this is what she says. So the whole community could hear it. She said, "There goes a," that N word we don't use here. "There goes an N who will someday be something that the rest of us N's will someday be proud of." You hear me? She knew because she helped shape him. She saw his attitude. They brought him the whole encyclopedia. All these ladies of the night put it together. He was the only student in school that had one. You know what I mean? And they saw his deportment. They saw his character. They saw his intelligence. They saw promise in him. And this is what John said. He said, what Sally Chickenfoot said, quote, I'm quoting him, was the greatest contribution to my spirit. Ain't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? John wasn't saying, oh, this woman here, she'd sell herself and all this and blah, blah. She got her nerves saying anything. No. He knew that this was a sister doing what she had to do to survive and that she took the time to love him and he appreciated it. That was the beauty of John. You hear me? So, as a mature scholar, I apprenticed under John, a warrior, a scholar, for about 25 years. He was for me a wise elder, a master, a friend, a brother, and I loved him deeply. And of course, my elder. Our relationship was close for a number of reasons. We had a lot in common. We both loved Africa. That was a big commonality. We both had a great respect for the Honorable Marcus Garvey. When John comes into Harlem, the Garvey movement's in decline. The left wing is on the rise, the Communist Party, and that became an influence on him. Socialism was one of his political philosophies. But he attended Garvey meetings and actually met Garvey in Canada when he was in exile, and didn't particularly like how Garvey was interacting with some of his members, because at that time, John and I were in another country. I'll talk about this later, but we had the same security. So the guy that was securing me secured him and related the story to me of what John saw Marcus Garvey do in terms of treating one of his members. He didn't think it was all that right. You know what I mean? But the point is, John respected Garvey, and a lot of his writings, and his most important one is a compilation of a number of articles that he wrote, Notes for the African World Revolution, Africans at the Crossroads. And it's a compilation of a lot of different articles that John wrote. So John had a common respect for Garvey. Garvey was my first master. And we both loved Malcolm. And so we had a lot of discussions on Brother Malcolm, And John had put out a book called Malcolm X, The Man in His Times. He edited the book and wrote a chapter in it. Betty Shabazz, Malcolm's wife, wrote a chapter in it. A number of people that knew Malcolm. And John read my book, The Political Legacy of Malcolm X, and he liked the book. And then he was kind enough to let me go through his basement and look at his Malcolm X material, Political Legacy of Malcolm X. This is the first book I wrote. And so, we had a lot of discussion about Big Red. And John was a principal advisor to Malcolm on Africa. And John told me the story where at one point Malcolm is going to face a debate with the foremost scholars on the Congo and Africa. The role of Leopold from Belgium in the Congo. And so Malcolm didn't have a lot of information on this. So John pulled together a file for him. And it was a file on Mark Twain's soliloquy on the Congo. And Mark Twain was a radical. He was a novelist, but he was a radical. And so one of the things that John would often talk about Malcolm about was that he was a quick study, that he could get information and digest it very quickly and then use it in a way that he could knock out an opponent, in a debate or anything else. And so he sent him this file, and then he watched the debate, and Malcolm cleaned the clock. He defeated the foremost scholars on the Belgian role in the Congo. I mean, he took them out, beat them, but that was Malcolm. We both agreed that he had the best, we would say best mind, but I would qualify that and say best political mind in the US of anybody. That political mind was something else. And it was backed up like it was with John, with integrity. And then, of course, if you watched any interactions with Malcolm and John, Malcolm would make fun of John's pork addiction. And John would, come back with something like, pork got Black people a long way. And then he'd tell me, as I told you earlier, maybe if he hadn't ate pork, he might still have his eyesight. But he'd laugh on that one. You know what I mean? Malcolm was, John Henrik Clarke was a part of the intellectual team that made up the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Him, Doc, Ben, and others. And they wrote the basic program for the Organization of Afro-American Unity because Malcolm was away in Africa after his being forced out of the Nation of Islam. And so that was part of his interaction with Malcolm. And as I pointed out before, as a leader in the Black freedom, Black power movement, we were a major influence on Malcolm. And CORE, of all of the Black freedom movement organizations, had the greatest influence because we were where Malcolm was. And we had exchanges. I've talked about the one I had, but he had exchanges with us across the country in the North because the nation didn't have a base in the South other than Atlanta, maybe a few other areas, but it was basically a Northern organization. So we influenced his thinking so much that his brother said, one of his older brothers, he was beginning to sound more like the Black freedom movement than the Nation of Islam. And that's true. But he influenced us in a big way. So Malcolm was a big love. We shared that love, a big love, John chaired Black Studies at Hunter College. And I chaired Black Studies at San Francisco State University, the mothership for Black Studies at four-year university and probably period. So we shared stories of our headaches in chairing Negroes. Not all of our faculty was Negroes, but we had some Negroes on our faculty. And we talked about the headaches involved in that. And then he would always question me about one person in particular that he helped advance to a PhD and turn them on to information on the Communist Party's youth wing and research that person could do for their PhD, which they got. And I was telling him what a disappointment she was. So we would share stories, positive and negative, you know what I mean? But, it was, similar stuff we were doing. John and I shared speaking platforms together. We spoke back to back at Malcolm X College. That's in Chicago. That college has Malcolm's Oldsmobile in the lobby. And we were brought out by a Black church to speak, me on a Friday night and John on a Saturday night. Again, as I said before, whenever John would go to a conference, he'd stay for the whole thing. He didn't just come for his part and fly out. Even when he was sick, he would do that because that was the respect that he had. But he was also there to hear what other people had to say and see if there was anything to learn, So that evening I spoke, and mine is taped, it's on a DVD. on the critics of Malcolm. I did a critique of people who had criticized Malcolm. So he's in the audience. And then the following evening, he spoke. And he spoke on Islam, Malcolm and Islam, and particularly his relationship with Orthodox Islam. Because by then, when he broke with the nation or was forced out, he was in Saudi Arabia and other places interacting with Orthodox Islamic figures. So he was going through the politics of that. I have part of that tape. I don't have the DVD. So that was important. In the 70s, I organized a group called the Pan-African Secretariat. And this came out of the Sixth Pan-African Congress, where I chaired the political committee to the Sixth Pan-African Congress. And we forged relationships with Blacks in the United Kingdom that we've managed to this day. A group called the Pan-African Congress Movement and others. And so coming back, I formed Pan-African Secretariat, and we had chapters in different parts of the country and in Tanzania, which was a part of Pan-African People's Organization, but also Pan-African Secretariat. And so one of our chapter chairs was a brother named Yemi Toure, and he was a journalist. He was also a book collector. When his mother died, he inherited a huge library. He had a huge library of Black books. So we had a national convention every year for 1 year. That was my idea. But then he came up with this idea to rename it, and it proved to be brilliant. We call it the State of the Race Conference. And so for about 5 or 6 years, we'd gather 1,000 people in either LA or San Francisco. And we would bring in our best scholars, John Henrik Clarke, Dr. Joseph Ben Yochanan, Dr. Chancellor Williams, Minister Louis Farrakhan, and others, a host of others. My good friend, Kehinde Solowazi, has a picture of this. Let me see if I can get this up here so you can see it. Yeah. And you see on the side there, the one with the suit on, that's Chancellor Williams. Next to him is May Mallory. And next to him also is Queen Mother Moore. And then the brother with glasses is Yemi Toure. And then on the side is me with a big natural and a brother looking down with a cast on his hand. That's Kehinde, my friend. And then there are others there. My former wife, and also in this picture, a brother from the UK. See if I can get this up right. Yeah. Brother from the UK. Ron Phillips, who led the Pan-African Congress delegation, the Sixth Pan-African Congress, who was from Guyana, was an engineer. So we interacted through those conferences, and John also spoke at African Liberation Day and would stay at my home along with Doc Ben. And when we had Doc Ben, my main task was to keep Doc Ben on point, because Doc Ben was a great scholar, but he tended to go off, and he'd go off and digress into things that might be interesting in a conversation, but in a speech, we wanted him to stay on the topic. So he would always talk about heaven is between a Black woman's legs, and that would become a speech. And I says, hey, John, we all know that, Doc Ben. I said, not John. We all know that. Talk to the subject. And I'd have him at my house for a couple of nights. And so he'd get drilled in his head every day. Stick to the topic. Stick to the topic. He'd stick to the topic. And then he would also tell his humorous stories. Quite interesting. Doc Ben was something else, So that was another way in which we interacted. Both of us had a common interest in Africa and common work in Africa. And both of us spent time, when we went to Africa, living with everyday people, me in the villages and in other ways interacting with African people. When John went to Ghana and Nigeria in the 50s, he had very little money. He had been working at that time, as before he became a professor, he was working at a radio station doing janitorial work and stuff, and then got to do a series on African history that got played on one of these major stations. And so with the little money he had, he was able to go to Africa. And so the two places that were really important for him was Ghana and Nigeria. And so he's in Ghana, and he's living in the poorest part of Ghana, living with Ghanaians. And this is also, see, these poor communities were not any different from the communities he was raised in. And by living with the people, he got to know them, know their culture, know their history in a way that you don't get in any book, you know? And so one day he's standing out on the road, and Kwame Nkrumah is now prime minister, and he comes in with his entourage, big vehicles and everything. And all of a sudden they come to a screeching halt. And Nkrumah's bodyguards jump out and surround John. And Nkrumah said, leave him alone. He stopped because he saw John. And when John told the story, he had a big smile on his face. You know what I mean? He was so proud. And Nkrumah said to him, you must really love Africa with your black ass living in the poorest part of Accra. Accra is the capital of Ghana. And he said, well, yeah, you know, that's where I'm living. And so he gave him a job working for his newspaper, you know, and John was so proud of that. But John knew Nkrumah through the study group that he had with Dr. Wallace Huggins, one of his masters. I'm not going through his apprenticeship stuff and all of that. Ogawa, get this stuff off of the screen here. You got it? Get it. So this was a part of the stuff that was key to John, you know, that he had this kind of thing going on, that he was in contact with the people. My time was working in Ujamaa villages for 3 months, living on coal floors, concrete floors, and then interacting with Africans each time we went, you know, whatever office they were in, but usually the grassroots. So he learned a lot through that. And it contributed to his knowledge of African history and African culture. The last time John and I spoke together was in London in 1995. And it was African Liberation Day conference in London. And he and my first wife, Anasa Tashaka, spoke. He, I, and her, we spoke. And this was 1995, so it was right after the Million Man March, and John was a critic of the Million Man March. So I had to take John aside and explain to him stuff he didn't know about the Million Man March, because he was focused entirely on Minister Farrakhan, and I had to explain to him that the National Black United Front was key to this organizing, that I was a follow-up person for the Million Man March, that I spoke at the Million Man March, and that it had some programmatic directives and stuff. And John listened, and he said, oh, that was John. You know what I mean? He went out on a limb on something, and then maybe he didn't know everything. You could pull his coat. He'd listen. He said, oh, you know what I mean? Oh. So that was the last time that we interacted on a podium. And then the last time I saw him was 1998, when he was near death at his wife's house. It's a condo in New York. And I interviewed him for the last interview on the Masters in his life. And this was his mature period. It was the best interview I had of all the interviews. And he was dozing off at that point because his energy was really gone, but mentally alert, you know? And then in 1996, this was before my last meeting with him, John was too ill to travel. Cancer had begun to hit him again. And so he sent, because there was a conference of ASCAT, the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization, held in Ghana. And I went, and others went. He couldn't go. So he sent a written short message that Greg Kamantha Carr, who's chair of Black Studies now at Howard University, because he was a young Turk, they had a youngster read it. What was so impressive about this statement was, it was very short. It probably was 6 minutes in reading, whatever, 4 or 5 pages, was the amount of citations that John cited that nobody in this room knew anything about. John had drawn from so many sources, and being in New York, where he was exposed to the international currents as well as the national currents coming out of New York and out of the United States, that it was just vast. And I realized that apprenticed all this time under him, and these are people I'd never heard of before. And then, earlier, this was in the 70s, John and I are getting ready to do a presentation at Haki Marabute's place in Chicago, and we had time. So I had my tape recorder. I pulled it out. I said, "Hey, John, tell me about Kwame Nkrumah." These are the most insightful remarks that he ever made on Nkrumah. And then told me, "Don't be telling people what I said there. I still have the tape. I'm honoring his request." And then he honored me by, as I pointed out before, writing the introduction to the book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. This was in 1995. And he had cancer, but it was in remission at this point. And I really didn't expect him to write that. I knew he probably would, but I knew that he was so busy and everything else that if he didn't, I'd understand. And so I get this review. Asa Hilliard provided the other. And I've said this before. In my life, I've never had this experience, a warm feeling on my stomach. That was love. Love. And so I called his secretary to tell her to tell John, thank you. I didn't really expect him to put the time into this because John was blind, so he had a reading machine that Bill Cosby and some others nationalists had put together money, and they bought in this reading machine. So the reading machine would talk so that he could, understand what he was going through. So that was John. And so the lady who volunteered his time and John paid them to work for him, she said, "Tell him that." And I told him that, and then later came and delivered him the book. So the last 8 months of his life, I interviewed him on the masters in his life and got to see the nuances in his development and got to exchange a lot of things with him, see the sadness about certain periods of his life that he wished had gone better, and to see the monumental things that he was proud of, to see what really lifted him up after he had to come out of facing blindness and all of this. And so losing him was a sad thing, but he left so much. He did so much. He awakened so many people. He was kind to so many people, and he left a vision of Africa. And Wesley Snipes' film, A Great and Mighty Walk, was a beautiful testimony to John, sitting up in a chair as a jelly, an African historian, pontificating on African history. So this has been my life knowing Professor John Henrik Clarke, a magnificent expression of African American culture. This is just a small part. There's all kinds of stuff that I don't have time to go through here. So I hope you got something out of that. Hotep. And let's see if people have any questions. Yes, Bill Cosby gave him that. Chad, Rip Khalid Abdul Muhammad, the Million Youth March. Yes, Khalid Muhammad called the Million Youth March after the Million Man March, and Sisters called a Million Woman March that was an outstanding march, really an outstanding march. This is Ty 313. I didn't know Bill Cosby was pro-Black. I'm not in defense of Bill Cosby. What Bill Cosby did was wrong. Bill Cosby deserved what he got. So get that straight from me. But yes, Bill Cosby did a lot of stuff on Black consciousness. And there's one film that he's done on Black history that's just outstanding, And he did a lot of other things. Unfortunately, he wasn't practicing what he preached, Unfortunately. And he paid the price, but he got out. But he paid a price. But what he did was sad and sick. Doozy, did John Henrik Clarke have any thoughts regarding hip hop and youth culture? We never talked about hip hop, and John passed in around 1998, but he had an appreciation of Black youth and their condition. And so his message was a message picked up by the hip hop generation. And in fact, John played a major role in the African centered cultural renaissance, and particularly the movement to get African history into the public school curriculum. He was a part of the African American Baseline Project coming out of Portland, led by the Black United Front, that I was national vice chair of, and I led that movement to get that curriculum in the public schools. John wrote the social studies section, along with 16 other scholars, under the leadership of Dr. Asa Hilliard, after the National Black United Front boycotted the schools in Portland, Oregon, with an 85% effective boycott led by a brother named Ron Herndon, who's still around. And he was chair of the Black United Front in Portland, and was one of 4 founders of the National Black United Front, myself, him, G2 Weusi, and Reverend Herbert Dowtry. And G2 Weusi was the field marshal. He was the person orchestrating this. So hip hop in the 90s was heavily influenced by Afrocentrism. And John Henrik Clarke was one of the stars that influenced them. So in that sense, in terms of his understanding and knowledge of hip hop, we never talked about it. Can you talk about his meeting with Professor Sheikh Anta Diop? John, in the discussion that we had with Dr. Theophil Obenga, he talked about interacting with John Henrik Clarke when he was in France, and John was there. And John contributed to Presence Africaine, which was a magazine of African scholarship put out by Francophone Africans, French-speaking Africans. Diop's writings appeared in that. So John was a person who encouraged the publication of his book, Civilization or Barbarism, and was the one that encouraged Leonard Jeffries to translate it, because Leonard Jeffries speaks French fluently. So that was part of John's contribution. John was a person who pushed for the publication of Sheikh Anta Diop's books. One of John's roles as a scholar was he wrote introductions to books. So he didn't write a lot himself. He wrote a little, but he wrote a lot of introductions to books, and was also somebody pushing the publication of books. And so the publication of Sheikh Anta Diop's works was a major thing that John Henrik Clarke encouraged. Ty 313, did Baba Clarke have anything he saw for our future or an African American part of our history to look at more deeply? If you read the book, African World Revolution, Africans at the Crossroads, John talks a lot about power, and he talks about African power and the importance of Pan-Africanism and the role of Pan-Africanism in unifying African people globally. And so he saw a special need for that. John had an appreciation for traditional African culture. And while he respected Kwame Nkrumah, he also felt that Nkrumah had been in the country too long, the United States, and had kind of moved away from some of the foundational principles of African culture. So John was familiar with the thinking of people like Dankwa, who ended up being an opponent of Nkrumah, but was the person whose party brought Nkrumah to Ghana to lead Ghana to independence, expecting Dankwa to be the president of Ghana, and Nkrumah ended up forming his own party and taking that position himself. But John felt that Nkrumah could have done better had he drawn more from traditional African culture in his program for Pan-African unity. He respected Nkrumah and respected his commitment to a united Africa. But he thought that this was a missing link, and an important missing link. And I think he was correct in that, because Danquah, while a conservative, did appreciate traditional culture, and had more of that been done, I think that Ghana would be in a better position today. Nkrumah supported, I pointed this out in a previous show, he supported Chancellor Williams' work in writing his book on the rebirth of Africa, African civilization. His best work, Better Than Destruction, Black Civilization. That was John's opinion. It's mine. I think most people who read it, they're both classics, but this is outstanding. He interviewed thousands of Ghanaians on what they saw as a future for Africa. And they concluded that they didn't want capitalism. They didn't want Marxism. They wanted cooperative democracy, where the people shared in the wealth and made the decisions. And he also wanted, the people said they wanted their leaders to come to them, consult them, and then go off and do their national business. That's the old African way of running a country. And unfortunately, Western trained Africans don't do that. So that was part of it. John felt that we need to have a sense of power here and how to wield power. John spoke about his time in the Army. Yes, he did. He said it was a waste of his time. I say the same thing with my Marine Corps experience. I didn't use anything that I learned in the Marine Corps. I already knew how to shoot, and I already had a war spirit. I don't attribute nothing that I've been able to do as an organizer to being in the Marine Corps. You know what I mean? And I certainly didn't. I was just brainwashed. I had, watched John Wayne movies and stuff till I woke up. So John was a master sergeant in the Army, and he was into supplies and stuff. So that's what they had blacks doing, supplies and stuff, not too much World War II. And he was stateside. He was never in Europe, fortunately for him. So that's what he did. And he met the love of his life in the Army. And his regret was that he didn't marry her. That was his big regret in life. He said they made love just by talking. That was his big regret in life. Africa Optimist. It's a nice name, sister. Did Dr. Clarke visit any other African countries aside from Ghana? Yes, including Nigeria. And he saw that Nigeria was set up for civil war, because what he saw was that the British had mixed together combustible elements, meaning nations that had been at war with each other. They mixed them all together. So they knew that an explosion was likely to happen, and it led to a civil war. John was following master scholarship and doing studies while he was in Africa, but that was a major one. He was in Nigeria and particularly in Ghana, and did a little writing while he was there. Chad Jomo Kenyatta. It's good that it's interesting you asked this question. Was Jomo Kenyatta at the conference in your picture? No. In fact, Jomo Kenyatta was no longer alive. Just asking because I'm named after him, and I read about the peace conference back then. Jomo Kenyatta attended the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945. Jomo Kenyatta was a great disappointment. He was a great disappointment. He sold his people out, I'm sorry to say. I was in Kenya in the 70s and ran into Kenya, but I already knew the story because I knew the history in Ghana. Jomo Kenyatta had been put in prison during the independence movement. And during that time, the Mau Mau movement, which they never called themselves that, rose up. It was an independence armed struggle movement trying to free the Kenyans from British colonialism. When Jomo Kenyatta comes out of prison, he orders these Mau Maus to come out of the forest. He gives them a short time. He put a man named General China in charge of issuing the orders. And when they came out, they gave up their weapons. And when they were coming out, they saw Jomo Kenyatta surrounded by white troops. And they said, Mzee, that's Swahili for elder. Mzee, have they captured you? No, these were the people he trusted to protect him. They were disarmed and then disowned. The people who fought for armed struggle didn't get anything, and Jomo Kenyatta sat over that. He was one corrupt politician, no good. Sorry. You know what I mean? Sorry. And you've just seen played out again the Jomo Kenyatta election, where Odinga, who had been his vice president, his son has run and got cheated out of an election by Kenyatta's people, grandson or whatever. So you got a few people in Kenya controlling the wealth and driving people into poverty. Lady K. Mosley, one of the real conscious ladies and brothers who watch the show, she says, we were all brainwashed, Baba, in the military. When we now know better, we do better. Thank you for your continued teachings. Yeah, I admit, I was a remote control automatic pilot, 00 soul Negro. I was the best Marine, the baddest Marine. And when I woke up and my commander, company commander, Pete McCloskey, who was not a bad guy, ended up being a progressive Republican who gave Geronimo Pratt's lawyer the information that sprang him from prison after, Geronimo Pratt, a major leader in the Black Panther Party, spent a lot of his time in solitary confinement. This guy, this later congressman, he was then a captain in the Marine Corps, Pete McCloskey. He had served in Korea, where the Chinese kicked their behinds. They called it a strategic withdrawal. He wanted me to go through officers training school because I've been in the ROTC, lieutenant colonel. I was the best. Anything I'm in, I try and be the best. But by then I was waking up. I was in Corps. I was in the Black Freedom Movement. And I had a year and I'm out. 63. I become chair of Corps. I'm out of, the Marines. I got honorable discharge. I don't have to worry about going to jail to refuse to fight in Vietnam or nothing like that. But not a single solitary thing did I get out of the Marine Corps that I used in the Black Liberation Movement. Nothing. I was a machine gunner, mountain leadership training, desert warfare training, amphibious landing training. You know what I mean? All that stuff. And when I was a Negro, I liked it. I was in the ROTC, lieutenant colonel. They gave me the award of the best cadet in the whole city. That's me. I'm a soldier. But I finally found out my Army. It ain't the Marine Corps. And then one of the shows we did, we had James Smalls on, one of the brothers I really love. That's one beautiful brother, James Small. And I had the introduction where our teacher, who teaches in our school, African Children's Advanced Learning Center, this school's been in operation since '72. And most of our kids end up in college, most of them with scholarships. And so Robert Woods, master poet, he read a poem introducing that interview. When you go to the shows, go look at the one with James Smalls on it and watch that. And he does a poem called America the Pimp. That's by his best friend, Lodge Daly, who had been a Soledad prisoner, got out of prison, became a PhD psychologist and whatnot, died a few years ago. That introduced that. But before that, hey, man, oh, God, well, get this crap out of here, Before that, there was, after his presentation, actually before that,